Now I'd like to introduce our guest plenary speaker, Dr. Marcus Lambert. Dr. Lambert is an associate professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics and associate vice president for research strategy and operations at the SUNY Downstate Health Sciences University campus. In his role, Dr. Lambert focuses on initiatives to expand Downstate's extramurally funded research portfolio. And he's also the contact PI of the Translational Program of Health Disparities Research Training, or Transport, which is a very large $10 million program from NIH that's focusing on health disparities and on recruiting and training underrepresented minority scientists. Prior to his time at SUNY, he was an associate dean of diversity and student life and assistant professor of education research and medicine at Weill Cornell Medicine, where he led a large NIH-funded IMSD program, or initiative to maximize student development. Some of you may be aware of a similar program here on this campus. This is an amazing program that takes a lot of dedication, but it brings new students interested in biomedical sciences into education and research careers. He's also a member of several national boards, including the Cell Press Rising Black Scientist Awarded Academic Advisory Board. And importantly, he's a member of the NIH NIGMS Training, Workforce Development, and Diversity Study Section, which is a very important study section that reviews many of the proposals that those of you who are applying for as postdocs actually see. And so it's a very pivotal and important role at the national level. He received his Ph.D. in biomedical sciences from NYU Grossman School of Medicine and his BS from Howard University. And he also holds an MS in clinical epidemiology and health services from Weill. So thank you very much for joining us, and let's welcome together let's welcome you to give us your thoughts on mentoring and equity. Thank you, Dr. Lambert.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lawson, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to meet you, Dean Anthony. Thank you for your comments. And just a really huge thank you to Jennifer and Heather. You all are really phenomenal, just in terms of not only, just your help in organizing this, but this event in and of itself. I think just really amazing to honor excellence in mentorship, particularly for postdoctoral fellows. And I think particularly for postdocs in the week of National Postdoc Appreciation Week. So I think it's just a really great time to honor excellence in mentorship. So let me share my screen. I just have a few sort of slides to guide my discussion here. And can everyone see that okay?
Looking good.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. So the title of my talk is Jedi-Inspired Mentorship. I think it's a really interesting, fun title. I hope this to be a bit of a fun talk. I was asked to speak about enhancing diversity, equity, and inclusion through mentoring. And you might wonder why I decided to choose Star Wars instead. And let me see if I can move this out of the way so you're not seeing that. So I think I've always been a big Star Wars fan. And to tell the truth, though, Star Wars, I think, has a lot to do with mentorship. And this image in particular here is from The Empire Strikes Back, probably one of the best Star Wars films, where our young hero, Luke Skywalker, has traveled to the Dagobah system in search of his wise Jedi master, Yoda. And just like Luke Skywalker, I think I've carried my PI on my back, literally, and learned the ways of the Force. And I'm just joking. But I probably the reverse, my PI carried me. But in many ways, I learned the ways of the Force, AKA science, through mentorship. But what I think I really want to talk about is not so much Star Wars. I think, it's a really great analogy and we'll get there. But I want to talk about, the Jedi portion. And Jedi actually really stands for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And, if we just break down, some of these terms here, just so everyone is on the same page, I think we all understand what diversity means. it's the difference between us. How often do we look around our spaces and, we find different people of different backgrounds, different experiences, different cultures, different ways of thinking, but also different races and ethnicities and gender identities. And, all of that is welcome. And there are a number of papers that talk about the benefit of diversity to innovation, particularly in science. So I think diversity is not unfamiliar to us. Inclusion, I think, is another term we often hear. It really refers to the sense of belonging in an environment. Do you feel like you're a part of the fabric of the institution? Do you feel like you belong, or do you feel included? And sometimes, there are times where, we've felt excluded. I think we all know what it feels like sometimes to feel excluded from something and to not feel included. I remember certainly when I was a graduate student, my first year in graduate school, feeling somewhat, isolated. I was probably one of few who looked like, me in terms of, identifying as African American. And there's actually another guy who identified as African American. We don't really look alike, but sometimes we would be mistaken for each other. And, we would just joke that, I'd be like, hey, Marcus, and he'd be like, hey, Caleb, just almost in a joking way, because we would get mixed up so often. But, he was just almost opposite of kind of who I am, more outgoing, outspoken, just a really different sort of guy. But it almost kind of, that experience, many times made us feel sort of, like people who really didn't know us, or made us not feel like we were a part of the department or the institution. And I could tell you plenty of times where, I would walk through a door and someone would try to close it back behind them, not thinking that I belonged there, that I was a student or a scientist. One particular time stands out really vividly in my mind. There was a bike rack that was behind a locked door. And, at the time I was a graduate student, I was wearing a hoodie, probably had my hood on a little bit. But, bringing my bike that I paid for to use this bike rack where I could lock my bike, but it required an ID in order to access it. And there was someone else in front of me. So this person, buzzed in with their ID to unlock the rack in the room to lock the bike up. And I'm coming in behind the person. So they're looking back, they pause, look back again. And then they finally sort of ask me, do you have an ID? This is, for people who are, locking up their bikes who go to this particular institution. So I said, yes, I have an ID, and felt the need that I had to, prove that I had an ID. And then, this person literally wanted me to swipe just to prove that I could, also get in the bike area. And, I swiped it and proved that I paid just like this person did. So I locked my bike up, and on the way out, I just had to let the person know that, as I said, you don't remember me? I was a student in your class last semester. So, these sort of experiences sometimes make people feel excluded, make people don't feel like you don't really feel like you belong sometimes when you have these sort of experiences. And they still happen from time to time. I think even in 2021, when we would hope that people wouldn't be having these sort of experiences. I think the next term I want to touch on is equity. And I think we often hear a lot about this. Sometimes people use it synonymously with equality, but they're actually quite different. Equity refers to allocating resources to ensure that everyone has access to the same opportunities, right? Equity recognizes that there are advantages and sometimes barriers to all of the isms that exist, whether it's sexism or racism or ableism or all of these isms. And equity helps to provide the support to make sure that people have equal access. And you can see in the sort of icon here, not all of the, podium that everyone is sort of behind or standing on is of equal heights, but it provides an equitable access to that so that everyone is of equal height. But the last thing I'll talk about is justice. And justice, I think we've seen a lot more of in terms of recent years, especially with 2020. Justice, I believe, refers to dismantling the barriers or the resources to resources and opportunities in society, right? Justice is making sure that everything is balanced, everything is right-sided in a community. And this is the totality of JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And what I want to sort of challenge the audience about is using a JEDI sort of lens or framework to approach mentorship. And I think if we are looking at mentorship through the lens of inclusion, through the lens of equity, through the lens of justice, through the lens of diversity, then we approach mentorship in a more holistic way. We approach mentorship in a fairer way, a more equitable way, and a way that's more inclusive. And I think that is part, at least, of what's going to be needed in order to tackle some of the inequities that we see within science. And they exist. There are structural inequities within science, particularly in biomedical science, the sort of science that I was trained under. You see a lack of diversity in the biomedical workforce, but I think this is largely within STEM and largely within graduate and postdoctoral training. Obviously, a lot of the health disparities that we see nowadays, and certainly in the past, have been driven by structural inequities, particularly structural racism. This has been a driver for the health inequities that we see now. Think about like redlining or housing disparities or income disparities, inequities in terms of educational access. All of that plays into the health of our society and the health disparities that we see, and informs the scientific problems that we investigate. Of course, you're always going to have, basic scientists that look at, science for what it is, maybe just studying DNA for the sake of studying DNA. But a lot of the funded science that we often want to solve and explore is a result of health inequities and health disparities. And then there are actual funding disparities in and of itself among our scientists. And I'll talk a little bit about this on the next slide because I think it's quite interesting. And then finally, another example of just sort of the structural inequities and what they sort of lead to, something called racial battle fatigue, which is this sort of cumulative result of natural, race-related stress response based on your conditions. I think it's really epitomized in one author's sort of description. Dr. Uche Blackstock wrote an article last year, I believe, where she said, "I made the difficult decision to leave my faculty position at an academic medical center after more than 9 years there because of a toxic and oppressive work environment that instilled in me fear of retaliation for being vocal about racism and sexism within the institution." So I just want to, in some sense, paint, maybe not so much a sad picture, but a picture of the sort of structural inequities, the lack of diversity, and not to be so negative, but these are some of the things that we're facing. And the only way we're going to solve these things is that we have to kind of tear down some of those inequities, attack the root problems of it, and change our way of thinking, change our framework for how we look at the model of training. And again, I sort of argue and push for a sort of JEDI or justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion framework for that. I want to talk about one more thing, in particular, the funding disparities that you see as another example of structural inequities. If you look at the number of R01 grants that were put in by different racial ethnic groups, there was a paper that I think sparked this originally that came out, I believe in Science, a couple of years ago, that noted that Asian applicants and Black applicants in particular were significantly less likely to have the same R01 success as their counterparts in terms of race and ethnicity. And the Black applicants were 13 percentage points less likely, even when other things were normalized, to be as successful as their scientific counterparts. And if you look in 2013, only 52, this is actually the raw number, 52 Black investigators received R01 grants. Now that has increased. It's increased to 166 as of last year. So that's a 200%, 219% increase, which is fantastic. But there's still a funding gap of at least 8% that exists. So if you are a Black applicant, the likelihood of success is different than if you are a white applicant or an Asian applicant, or even a Hispanic applicant in this case. But there's still this funding gap. And the actual proportion of grants that go to Black applicants or recipients is actually only 2%, which is kind of small. If you look at Hispanic investigators, there's been an increase from 183 to 428. No funding gap exists in terms of the success and difference, but they still only account for 5% of the proportion of R01 grants. And you can see that our white and Asian counterparts account for 93%. So why is that? It turns out that at least 30% of this sort of funding gap is due to the fact that applicants, particularly Black applicants, are applying to institutes like NIMHD, where health disparities is being funded, and focused on areas of a particular field where there might be less funding. So the likelihood of success is, of course, a little bit less. Why is it that those particular applicants or more Black applicants are applying to certain fields than other fields? Well, I think it's a product of structural inequities and lack of access and exposure to certain fields and training and so forth. But the key part of that is the training part and the mentorship part. And here's where JEDI mentorship can play a role. I want to leave a couple anecdotes of advice. And this is particularly to our postdoctoral scholars who may be on the call. And most of these quotes come from Master Yoda directly. And I think we have a lot to learn from Star Wars, which again is, I think, a really great story about mentorship. So one of my favorite quotes from Master Yoda, and I promise I won't use the Yoda voice, but just imagine Yoda saying this: train yourself to let go of everything you fear to lose. And he's speaking this to Anakin Skywalker at the point where Anakin is like starting to see like premonitions and visions about Padme, his secret wife, for those who are not familiar with Star Wars. And he's, really being like starting to kind of, Yoda's like warning him, like, that is the path to the dark side. Like, you got to let go of this fear of losing the people that you love. And I think our message here as scientists, as postdocs, as trainees, is not to let fear sort of grip you from being successful, especially when you're just sort of transitioning these, when you have these sort of transition points from like starting your postdoc or starting your faculty position or starting an industry position, whatever you decide to pursue. Sometimes you come across, imposter syndrome or this sort of fear that you don't have the confidence or you're in your sort of ability. And, we've done studies on this and, we see it certainly at the transition points. But, my advice to you is that be confident in your research ability. You would not be here unless others thought that you had the capability to be here. And, it's challenging sometimes. I remember being like a graduate student, my first year, so I'm like doing rotations. PI asked me to, clone into this big vector. And, I had done some cloning before, but obviously didn't think I was the expert, but it just kept failing over and over and over. So, at this point, like the third time, I'm like, really embarrassed. And, the PI, he's like, okay, well, I'm gonna do the experiment side by side with you. So I'm like, okay, like that's the most embarrassing thing, the PI who doesn't often, come to the bench is like doing this experiment side by side with me. Fortunately, he's not successful either, but we have a meeting afterwards and we go to our collaborator and I'm sitting there, with my PI across from the collaborator. The collaborator says, hey, have you been successful, cloning into that vector? And my PI says, no, it's been giving us hell. And he just starts laughing. And we're like, what's funny? He's like, yeah, that vector is like notoriously, challenging. He says, we give it to rotation students just to kind of, play with them and laugh at afterwards. And I'm sitting here like, I'm a rotation student. So you can't doubt your abilities, right? Know that and trust that you are where you're supposed to be and that you're going to be successful. The next one, Yoda says, found someone you have, eh? So I just equate this to, when you are a trainee, when you're a postdoc, you got to go out and search for your mentors. Luke Skywalker went, systems to find a potential mentor when everyone thought the Jedi were non-existent. So you got to search out for the people that you want to train under, search out for the people that you want to be around. And most importantly, create this sort of mentoring network for yourself. Don't just rely on one person. I think oftentimes we get caught up into this idea that one mentor is going to fulfill all of the needs that we have. But in reality, it's multiple mentors that really best support us best. And they have different roles. Sometimes they'll be, that sort of academic mentor that we can bounce ideas off of. Sometimes they're a peer mentor that just is like, hey, let me ask you a silly, stupid question that I don't feel comfortable asking this person. Sometimes it's a coach, sometimes that person is not even in academia and they're just cheering you on and reminding you how great you are. Sometimes it's a sponsor, someone who's, really high up and has, this sort of dean title, who's willing to write a letter of recommendation for you. So have these people in your network and you have to cultivate them. You have to be strategic about building that. This is a quote from Yoda that talks about the Sith. It says, always two there are, no more, no less, a master and an apprentice. And, it sounds a lot like science, but it's talking about Star Wars. And particularly, I think it's the downfall of the Sith and the dark side. But I think it just reminds us of the importance, especially in an apprenticeship model like academia and science, the importance of choosing the right mentor. I think sometimes we almost take that a little lightly. We choose based on, we have similar research interests, but sometimes we fail to understand other qualities about this person that are going to make the relationship fruitful. So be smart about your pick and who you choose as a mentor, especially as an academic mentor. This one is a bit of a cheat. It's from Obi-Wan Kenobi. It's not actually from Yoda. He says, many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view. And I think this is a reminder to many of us who come from different backgrounds. Whether you are an international student or coming from a rural part of the United States or in some way marginalized or, part of a marginalized group, quote unquote, you have a point of view that may sometimes be different than the average person. Value that. That's an important aspect of what makes you unique, and it's going to come out through your science. Another quote from Yoda, remember, a Jedi's strength flows from the Force. Just in this case, replace Force with science or academia. And, in many ways, academia is a lifestyle. It's kind of what we spend most of our time doing. And yes, we're going to be motivated by our own science, but we're also motivated by other people around us. So find those affinity groups. Remember, this is where your energy comes from, your motivation. For those who know about Star Wars and maybe midichlorians, the Force is this energy that binds you and your institution and everything around you. So take advantage of that, cultivate that to your own sort of benefit. Yoda says, difficult to see, always in motion is the future. This is, I think, a reminder to us to think about our career paths, think about our next steps, not at the last minute, but now, meaning cultivate that mentorship network, think about how you're going to craft your future, have a number of different options. Don't just put all of, your eggs in one basket in terms of, oh, I want this and only this. But remember that you're training to be a scientist, or you may already be a fantastic scientist, and that skill set can be translated into many different aspects. And then I think finally, always pass on what you have learned. Speaks to science outreach. It speaks to mentorship. It speaks to just sharing wisdom to others around you. And as much as that can be beneficial to other people, it's also beneficial to you. It helps to motivate you. It helps to remind you of why you're doing what you're doing. And I guarantee you, it's extremely fulfilling. So just a reminder to all of our mentors, all of our mentees, and everyone who attended, this is the word cloud of what people think about when they think about a mentor. Being communicative, honest, personable, kind, patient, calming, supportive, empathy. Like, these are all sort of words that make you feel warm. They make you feel like you belong. They make you feel as if you're an equitable sort of voice in the room. And this is part of Jedi-inspired mentorship. So congratulations to all of the honorees, the finalists, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you today.
So thank you, Dr. Lambert. Thank you for those entertaining yet deep words of wisdom that we can draw from something that so many of us pay attention to all the time, which is the Star Wars movie saga. So I'd like to invite anyone who has a question to go ahead and enter it in the Q&A, and we can address it. But one of the things that I'm really interested in is, now that you're on you've spent some time being a mentor yourself, and now, seeing things at a larger macro scale, particularly in your role in reviewing, proposals from postdocs, but also in your role of developing these activities at your institution. What sort of what do you see as effective ways for postdocs to go about identifying mentors when they come to a campus? This is a big campus. Almost every campus is big and busy. Where does one start? You start obviously with the lab head or the person you're doing your postdoc with, but what are the pathways of expanding these networks that you think are useful?
Yeah, Mark, that's a very good question. I think the first step is may not be as obvious as one might think. The first step is actually a bit of a self-assessment. You kind of have to look inward to figure out, what are your needs? What do you need a mentor for? What are you looking for? What do you think you want to improve in? What are your goals? What are your objectives? And then when you kind of have that, I would recommend writing it out. When you kind of have it written out, maybe in an IDP or something, you have a better sense of, the type of mentor that you want to be a part of your network. And then from there, I think you can go out and sort of sometimes ask people, is there, someone who works in this particular area, or someone who, may have had these experiences, attend networking events, attend mixers, and just kind of get to know people. I think the hardest part is oftentimes strengthening those relationships, keeping in touch with people. And, sometimes it's just being yourself, because you never know where, a good person or a mentor might come about. And, you think you might be looking for one thing, and this person just is invested in you and willing to help you. So I think we have a very collegial, nature within academia and science. And most people usually find at least one person who's invested in their future. So it takes a bit of self-assessment first, and then I think some effort to go out and look for that.
I often see a lot of hesitance on trainees. A little fear of being vulnerable, I think, that prevents them from making that leap. And so I think that contributes to some of this confusion that goes on. So I'm going to turn to a question from one of our attendees. And that is, in your experience, what is the difference between ways to improve the Jedi mindset? Top-down institutional guidelines versus bottom-up feedback to mentors and other members in the network. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. And I think it's a bit of both. You know, I am a strong advocate for having sort of top-down, in the sense you almost have these sort of structural supports. And that could take a number of different forms. You know, when I was at my previous institution, Weill Cornell Medicine, we established, my colleague, who's just phenomenal, had this great idea of establishing these mentoring cascades. And what they were these essentially groups of, mentors. They included a faculty member, a postdoc, or it was also included of the medical field, so a resident, or a fellow, a student, more senior student, and sometimes a more junior student. And the mentorship could go many different ways. It could go between the postdoc and the student. It could go between the student and the student and the faculty, or the faculty and the student. And that sort of cascading mentorship, it just created a structure that allowed for people to, it created a space where you could talk about issues, where you could have people that you could call on. And, we recognized that every sort of matching would not be perfect. And it was up to, the group to sort of, facilitate that. But that structure, those regular meetings, it established something. But, you also need, I think, just reminders to individuals about how to talk with, sometimes their trainees. I know some faculty who, just their perspective is, the trainees are here to work, here to do their science, and that's it. But I find that a lot of the trainees, especially trainees who come from Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, really appreciate mentors who ask how they're doing, like really how they're doing, how their family's doing. They want to know their story, and just, appreciate the contextual parts of their background, and it makes them feel as if they're being seen. So sometimes those little things about how we approach our mentees are important, and also the structural things that help to cultivate a sort of mentoring milieu is really important.